Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Cosmin, to Freya, to Cheng, everyone in the Parasite team for having me. I'm also feeling really lucky because I get to spend a bit more time here in Hong Kong doing a residency, so it's a real thrill to be here. Can we play the first clip, sound clip? Clips by an album by an artist group that's composed mainly of musicians called Post-Commodity. We lost half the forest and the rest will burn this summer. We have no earlids. We are condemned to listen. These are the opening lines of an essay by the composer Armory Schaefer called Open Ears. While we can't close our ears, it doesn't mean that we listen to everything that's being said. And this is particularly true for those whose ears seem more closed more often than they're open. How can we attune ourselves to pick up different frequencies, to feel what reverberates, and to hear what sounds at the margins? What might be a decolonial practice of listening? Perhaps a missing component on discourses on decolonization is the practice of deep listening. It's a term that was made well known by the late composer Pauline Oliveros. In the visual arts, sometimes we're so conditioned by our eyes that we've all but forgotten about our ears. Many of our minor voices sound out into the void, even this void. Institutions, like people, are creatures of habit. Often they stick to their usual practices until they're cemented into method. And they're suspicious of change, especially when the pressure to change comes from a place of dispossession, not of power. Ways of doing things become embedded in the very architecture of buildings. They harden into mortar. They become part of the glue that holds it together. How can we chip away at this mortar so that it's not so airtight, so that we can let the sounds in from outside, so that light can come in through these cracks and illuminate the dark recesses, to bring our histories out of the shadows and to support voices where sometimes there were none? Lately, I've opened my ears, and this is what is sounding at the margins, and it's a chorus that's becoming louder by the day. It's a collective of minor voices filled with major players. You might call it a peripheral ensemble, but we practice every day. We condition our vocal cords and we find our tune. It might sound to some like a cacophony, but even noise is generative. Fred Moten and Stefano Harney write in Undercommons, Black Planning and Fugitive Study, that The cacophony is extra musical. We hear something in them that reminds us that our desire for harmony is arbitrary. In other words, listening to cacophony and noise tells us that there is a wild beyond to the structures we inhabit and that also inhabit us. I am listening, and this is some of the things that I'm hearing. A colleague of mine has a term that he calls against hungry listening. He came up with this because the newcomers to the lands where he's from, just on the outskirts of Vancouver, were initially called in his language the hungry ones. They were called the hungry ones because they were quite literally, in some cases, starving, but they were hungry for resources in the form of gold. And it seemed like that hunger was absolutely insatiable. It could never be quenched. And so his question is whether there's a possibility to have something like against hungry listening, so to listen without intent or to listen without a kind of accumulative factor or to listen without the idea that you might already have a sense of what you might hear. So what is, in that case, perhaps the time and the place of the sovereign as you're listening to me and I'm listening to you? Raven Chacon, who's a composer and a collaborator of mine, has a definition of music. And it comes from ideologies in Navajo. And you understand music in Navajo to mean beauty aligning with other beauty. So repeating sounds, overlapping, ceremony of sound, to break the spell or the convention of time that we've been forced to adhere to. Music is the basis for every ceremony. Art is the basis for every ritual. So what is decolonial listening? Decolonization, as we know it, is an active practice. It's a verb, not a metaphor. It's a present process that will hopefully echo into the future. I think that the way to begin this, the way to bring people to this place, is to first listen to who are here, to those who are here. And to also think of the structures that are existing that might oppose us. As Jack Halberstam wrote in the introduction to The Undercommons, thinking about Black resistance and agency, the structures that oppose us are not only bad for some of us, they're bad for all of us. He goes on to say that we cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that A, denies that anything was ever broken, this is in the context of the US, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, we want to dismantle, tear down the structures that right now limit our abilities to find each other. This is another sound that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few years. It was the cry of the Hamatsa song on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, which is the capital city of Canada. And it took place when I was living there, working across the river at a national institution, the National Gallery of Canada. And it was a copper breaking. So here behind me, we see an image of the late Chief Bodick holding up a copper shield. The copper shield wasn't something used to protect yourself in the face of warfare. It's actually considered to be a bank. And so it's a kind of cultural and also monetary investment that circulates among different families, and it continues to get invested in. And some of these coppers go back hundreds of years. And they were the things that during the potlatch bans in Canada, where Native peoples weren't allowed to take part in these ceremonies, these were the objects that completely confounded Indian agents, and they refused to give them any value. They were okay giving value to mass and other ceremonial objects, but these were a system of wealth and reciprocity that was outside of their knowledge. So a few years ago, a copper-breaking ceremony, which is a shaming ceremony, took place on the steps of Canadian Parliament. It was the potential and the possibility and the action of shaming the Canadian government that was being brought all the way from Alert Bay on the West Coast, and that gathered a host of resistors along the way, thousands of people. There, on the steps of Parliament, singing the song of the Hamatsa ceremony, which is an initiation ceremony that still takes place, whereby boys become men and power is enacted by the not literal but metaphoric eating of the other. So here, the cutting of copper on the steps of Parliament is to shame the government for its injustices towards Indigenous peoples and their continued injustices. And the broken bits of copper, you see some of them here, were left as a gift and as evidence of the action. And they were wrapped up in this official apology for the residential school history in Canada, where up until the 60s, all Indigenous children were considered legal wards of the state. So you didn't belong to your parents, but you actually belonged to the state. And so therefore, they decided on your education, where you're going to live. And very often, this meant removing you from your family so that you could be assimilated into Canadian society. And so these are the words of the apology that many people didn't accept. And within that were rolled the broken bits of copper, and those were left on the steps of Parliament. And the response of the government was to send those bits of copper back to a museum in British Columbia, where I think it was more comfortable for them to have Aboriginal culture represented there. At the same time that these copper-breaking ceremonies took place was a national movement that spread to different parts around the globe. It was called Idle No More. And this is an image of an Idle No More protest in Quebec. And it was a grassroots movement that was started by 4 women from a prairie province called Saskatchewan. And what they were doing very often was staging these protests in official places of commerce, in shopping malls like this one, and here it is in the United States, where people would engage in the sharing of songs and also round dances. And it was organized and originated at a time of great discontent and out of the need to be heard, as well as a growing agency and movement. So we needed to come together at this moment in a kind of homelessness in order to reimagine our future, and as well to learn from improvisation. Improvisation was at the heart of the Idle No More movement, and its common form, the round dance, was something that everyone knew and could take part in, and where all songs were welcome and all rhythms accepted. So we refused to be the broken part. And I wondered at the time if what we were hearing was a call to order, and whether it should be, or could it be, and can it be, and is it now? One of the people who took part in this is the activist and scholar, Anishinaabe activist and scholar Leanne Simpson, who recently released a great book of poetry called Islands of Decolonial Love. And in that book, she quotes someone else, Junot Diaz, and where he writes about characters that he was creating at the time in fiction. He said, "The kind of love I was interested in is the only kind of love that could liberate them from this horrible legacy of colonial violence." He says, "I'm speaking about decolonial love. Is it possible to love one's broken by the coloniality of power self in another broken by the coloniality of power person?" That's his question. So we can listen to just a short bit of this clip, like 10 seconds. So that became a kind of soundscape that summer. It was also a soundscape that extended to the place where I live now in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And when we took part in the Idle No More dances there, it was in the parking lot of an outdoor mall. And at first, the security was really confused because they didn't know initially whether this was something that they should join in on because it seemed like a celebration. And then they started asking around, and then they noticed that people were also handing out leaflets, and they started looking at the leaflets and realizing, maybe this isn't what they thought it was. It's not a parade of some sort. It's not just a celebration of culture. It's something else. And then their reasoning for getting us to disassemble was that this was private property. So property that is presumably public becomes private very quickly if you're not there to consume. This is an earlier work from 1991, 1992 by Rebecca Belmore. And it was a megaphone that was acted and activated and came out of a protest. And it's one that's sounding again. And here I think of the potential of noise, of that cacophony that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney think about, and that, we don't necessarily need to invest ourselves always in harmony, but maybe we need to trust confusion more. So this megaphone was built after what was called the Oka crisis, where a mayor of a small French town in Quebec, in Canada, was really interested in golf. And he really wanted to expand the 9-hole golf course into an 18-hole golf course. But the expansion of these additional 9 holes would go over traditional Mohawk lands, and what was used for many years also was understood as burial grounds. So the situation got really heated, and it was the first time in Canadian history, modern Canadian history, that the military was called on to kind of keep back the protest of its own Canadian citizens. So there were blockades and barricades. People died. It was found out after that one of the policemen who was shot was actually a victim of friendly fire. But the person who did die, he was not killed, he was only injured. The person who did die was an elderly grandfather who, when they were releasing people from the community, from Ganawage and Ganasadage, it was first the elders and children who were let out. And the reason they were let out is because the military wasn't letting in any food or supplies anymore, and so people who needed medicine had to leave. And at the same time, the Molson Brewery, a beer brewery, quite a famous brand in Canada, decided to let out its workers to protest the exodus of these people from their land, and they started throwing rocks, and one went through a window and hit this grandfather in his chest, and he died of a heart attack. But his death is often not broached within that in mainstream media. So it started in March 10th, 1990, and then it quickly escalated. But the land rights of the people of Ganasadage have been continually degraded since the 1700s, and they've never officially, in fact, had a reserve by the Canadian government. They have their land, but even since that time, their rights to it have been absolutely muddied. So what women did was they formed a line to protect the stand of trees that grew over the burial grounds of years past. And this line escalated into a bitter 78-day protest. And Rebecca saw this as an opportunity to speak back. So in 1991, in time for Canada to be embarking on a number of activities to celebrate 500 years since the arrival of Columbus, which a lot of people, Native people in particular, didn't see this as a reason to celebrate, she oversaw the building of a massive megaphone that was made out of finely inlaid wood veneer and decorative finishes of elk hide and skillfully cut leather lashing. And then this megaphone toured for more than a year to different communities, to where people wanted it and where they felt like they needed it. And its large size echoed the degree of tone deafness towards the issues at that time facing Indigenous communities and it became something of a transitory monument. It was a means to amplify voices of the dispossessed and to enlarge a platform for growing agency among Indigenous people. So when the megaphone came to different communities, people used it for different reasons. Some people sang into it, some people just played the fiddle, others made remarks, including like this one, and you'll have to excuse the quality of the sound. It's because the megaphone is being projected through another smaller megaphone, so it lends a lot of layers of distortion to the voice. So if we can play just a short clip. So you can see some of these were like celebratory as well, some of these statements. That's good, thank you. So Rebecca is one of the artists I invited to work with for Documenta 14, and that was an exhibition that took place in both Athens, Greece, and Kassel, Germany, considered an exhibition, a single exhibition in 2 sites. And when Rebecca first came, and this was a year before the opening, so in April of 2016, one of the first places that she wanted to see was Piraeus Port, which at the time was one of the many refugee camps in Greece and in Athens. And this, as well, was a port that was recently purchased by a Chinese company, Costco. And she was really, afterwards, after this visit, she sent me this image because she was really struck by this contrast of the tents where people were living, and then this image of these old ships in the harbor. And then if you were standing there at the port, to your back would be all of the hundreds of massive cruise ships behind you for tourists to go to different Greek islands. Very quickly, people were moved from this temporary camp to places that were more out of sight, both on the outskirts of Athens and then farther north in Greece, and then finally into very contained camps that now are completely out of view, that are fenced in. And these are no longer temporary homes, but in fact, becoming increasingly more permanent encampments for people. So her idea was then, if there's a possibility to make a kind of monument to this, what many people are considering a permanent emergency. And so she worked with a local sculptor who in his studio only employs women, marble sculptors. And they worked to develop and sculpt this tent out of local marble that was taken from a marble quarry that's on the other side of the mountain where the original marble came to build the Parthenon. So she created a monument to the transitory out of local materials for people who are in constant motion and need to make their home wherever necessary. And once you're inside, this is your view. But really, it's the space between these 2 architectural monuments, one modest and temporary formed out of an emergency, and the other a symbol of democracy. And this space is to consider what is between these 2 poles, to think about where we're at now, and to consider for those whom forms of democracy fail because they're not considered citizens. So this work was installed on the top of Philippapu Hill, that's also known as the Hill of the Muses. It's even an older archaeological site than the Acropolis, which you see across the way. It's where ancient leaders came to talk and to gather. But this work was, to a certain subset of the community, was also seen as a great threat. It started to circulate in right-wing blogs and they made a new name for it. They were calling it the Monument to the Unnamed Refugee. And they saw it as an anti-Greek work or an anti-Greek monument. And they were using very derogatory terms. They were referring to refugees as monkeys. And then from there it spread among other right-wing blogs to the point where it got onto a nationalist website called Helas Force, where people were calling for it to be blown up by dynamite, in part because they saw the idea that somehow it was on the same level and the same perspective as the Parthenon to be incredibly degrading. And so this is one of the images that was, I think, a bit deliberately threatening of the tent on one of these sites, where you see the shadow of the man as he's taking a photo of the tent, so placing himself within the image, but not showing his face. So this is a bit of a little interlude. So there's a little-known intervention just south in New York, near Columbia University, in fact. And it's St. Paul's Cathedral in New York City, where people took an opportunity to speak back to authority. And I've heard in this story that they buried messages that were written in shells that were critical of the ruling powers of the day, and they built them right into the mortar of the building. So to cite R. Murray Schafer again from 1973, he wrote that, and this is, I think, incredibly pertinent now, he says that the ears of the state have never been more curious or more open. And these words, I think, are more true than ever today. Consider wiretapping, all of the illicit listening, collecting, archiving, all happening on behalf of our safety. Of course, we know that surveillance is a weapon of power. So if the state is an eavesdropping device and that ears are everywhere, how can we turn these ears to our benefit? This is an image of Aristotle's Lyceum. It's where people believe now that he developed the peripatetic school, or the school of learning while in motion, teaching while walking. And the reason that the school got this name is because he had a habit every evening of walking with his students through the gardens, and that it was through this motion of walking that he was able to think and to pass on his knowledge. So we know now that sound is weaponized, but this goes back a long time. During World War II, fighter jets flew low to simulate the dropping of bombs, to keep citizens on edge. In Guantanamo Bay, heavy metal music was blasted at intolerable levels in the belief that over time, the sonic barrage would psychologically break the interned. In some cases, it did. And now, non-lethal weapons, and they say that they're non-lethal, but that's debatable, that rely purely on hyperdirectional sound are commonplace. So Post-Commodity, a collective of artists, all born in the 1970s and based in the southwestern United States, recognize that while sound has the potential to harm, it might also have the potential to heal. This is an installation called The Ears Between Worlds Are Always Speaking. And it uses long-range acoustic devices, or called LRAD speakers, against their intended purposes. Originally designed for military, police, and Navy, they're increasingly used as sound cannons to disperse crowds at protests with deterrent tones, with tones so loud that they can make your ears bleed. But LRADs are also the clearest long-distance transmitter of the human voice, and they can relay messages clearly up to 2,000 meters. So they observed, the Post-Commodity observed the contradiction inherent in using these loudspeaker communications technology to silence voices of dissent. And so instead, they wanted to use it as an opportunity to broadcast stories and songs of necessary movement, of forced displacement, and transformational journeys, told in many languages by many speakers, and often translated. So stories of migration that came from the US-Mexico border would be translated into Greek and then sung in Greek in some cases, and vice versa. And during a time of the greatest mass migration in history, it's happening now. But for them, also, journeys have a kind of pedagogical dimension. So the installation broadcasts inside the Lyceum, inside the ruins of this ancient school. And the peripatetic school made early developments in philosophy and humanities and science and the study of mechanics and motion. It was also fundamental for understanding statics and dynamics. So in this work, motion takes on another dimension, possibly asking, what can we learn by listening to narratives of self-determination, and also in some cases, extreme helplessness? Can what you hear change what you see? We can play this clip. There's a final artist I want to talk about, too. And it's going back to the beginning, in fact, with a figure you saw initially as an activist, but also a very important artist, Bauduc. So I remember the first time I saw one of his masks. The mask was large. In my mind, it was too large to effectively wear in ceremony. It was made instead to hang on a gallery wall. It was carved of wood so dark it appeared charred. The face was both male and female at the same time. Long, coarse hair fell to either side, mixing with its mustache, which curled over red lips that were fixed in a permanent O, as though howling. I stood transfixed by the object, which seemed to hover at the threshold between the nameable and the unnameable. It led me to certain questions like whether an object's material source or its material nature is the source of its power, or does it reside somewhere else? And it looked to me like it could emit sound at any moment, and that it had a role in song. So in the summer of 2012, Bauduc performed something of a power transposition. It began with a solo exhibition at a Vancouver gallery that presented a series of carved masks and sculptures. And then midway through the exhibition's run, he removed 40 of the masks, the ones that you see hanging on the wall, and he took them to a small island off the coast of British Columbia to the small community of Alert Bay, where they were ceremonially burned. He invited his community, as well as his extended community, which meant artists, curators, as well as his gallerists, to witness the destruction. For him, the burning was not an end, but a beginning. The mass destruction part of a larger cycle bound with the obligation that accompanies tradition and the strict protocols of ritual. As he explained about them following the burning, he says, "What we have to do now is recreate them, and it is this that keeps them alive." At a time when power is more deeply tied to money than ever before, his project was a means to short-circuit the commodification of Northwest Coast ceremonial objects that's been going on since before the development of modernism, preventing them from becoming fetishes in the service not of ritual but of capital. And it also ensured for him that they're used as intended, taking away from the monetary value that they have in this world and making them real. So destruction becomes an active part of creation by detaching them or taking them out of this confining system. So the source of the resistance for him is the desire for them to be real. In Northwest Coast societies, The most valuable objects, like the coppers you saw before, are things that cannot be owned. They're passed down instead through generations, and they're hidden away in decorated boxes for safekeeping when they're not in use, until they're ready to be danced. And the masks themselves exist in the cyclical time of ritual. Ceremony ruptures the division between the historical and the contemporary, and the masks, in a way, thread their way through time, being continually remade in the same manner, irrespective of changes around them. So mask burning forms part of the potlatch ceremony that remains central to the Kwakwaka'wakw people of Alert Bay. And it was initially perceived as a threat to Western economic interests. In the late 1800s, it was banned in both Canada and the United States. And in a potlatch, status is often gained by the wealth that you can give away, rather than by the goods you accumulate. It's absolutely not self-serving, but it's to serve the community at large. And oftentimes the host would distribute or gift so much that they would bankrupt themselves. It was described as a worse than useless custom by Indian agents acting on behalf of the government. It was regarded as wasteful, unproductive, and contrary to civilized values. And when it didn't come to a halt altogether, participants were jailed or charged with heavy fines. Canada only dropped the ban in 1951. The US, where it wasn't as much of a threat, was in 1934. So what he was hoping to do with his performance was to clarify that the masks have an exchange value that is not based on currency, and certainly not our idea of paper money, but on social agreement. And as well, they expose the limitations of an art world that aspires to be global, as well as the inability in some cases of our contemporary art discourse to fully account for these things like his contemporary production as complex of these masks. When I think that we're still suffering from what we need to do with the excess created when the museum world tries to neatly recategorize our aesthetic and ceremonial production as art. And this is my conclusion. So back to Beau's action. And this is some of the colonial bounty, all of the potlatch items that were confiscated and taken away from communities during the ban. So in the announcement sent out in advance of the exhibition, the gallery provided some context to the event. The series of masks and ritual knowledge are owned by his family. They're passed down from generation to generation. And these ones are made quite roughly. They're made for dancing, and they're made for use. And when they're danced 4 times, then they're burned. So this grouping is nearing the end of its cycle. And midway through the exhibition, it was taken back and destroyed so that a new set could be created. So Beau Dick, in doing this, accorded the most important role to his community, and that is the role of the witness. So witnesses in attendance at potlatches are there to remember and to record the events and to transmit them to others. So this is now their duty. So with the market for contemporary art so inflated, it serves us well to remember other values attached to objects. Arjuna Padurai reminds us in The Social Life of Things that even though from a theoretical point of view, human actors encode things with significance, from a methodological point of view, it is the things in motion that illuminate their human and social context. So Beau Dick has mobilized another value system. His action is a reminder of the power that rests also in tradition and custom, and the influence and meaning held in objects that circulate within these other systems. So the composer Armory Schaefer says that the ear of the dreamer, the ear of the shaman, the ear of the prophet, and the ear of the schizophrenic share something in common. Messages are heard. So let us open our ears and start to listen again so that we can hear the sounds at the margin, and as it is these sounds that will help us expose where there might be a lack of hearing. So what is the sound of the mask? Is it a piercing scream? Or is it a deep and haunting howl? And with that, if we can play the last clip, thank you.